Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Social media has once again managed to do what nearly every modern invention eventually does, with the deepest regions of the human soul, no less. It's turned an ancient human reality into a channel for public validation. I'm talking specifically here about grief. I found out about this movement called Grief Talk from the New York Times, and I've been pondering quite a lot about it today. Grief used to be, it is a part of any civilization's existence. It is a non-negotiable part, and that's why throughout the history of anthropology, cultures have always developed structures to cope with and deal with grief. Outside of the Judeo-Christian revelation, that's not always been healthy, but cultures and civilizations have always attempted to do so. In the West, the civilized West, built on the Christian heritage, the Judeo-Christian heritage, grief was dealt with at the level of home, of church, even with the physical reality of a graveyard, with ministers of the faith, a priest typically, with a family structure and prayer life. All of these, and a calendar of sacred memory within the family, all of these actually taught the bereaved how to suffer, how to grieve, without allowing sorrow to swallow them alive because they're not defined by grief. Here's the problem. When you cast that Christian structure out of the social conversation, well, our very clever age then tends to outsource that need to something else. And today, it is those glowing rectangles we call our smartphones. Because now, rather than pour your heart out, A, before God, B, before your family, C, before ministers of the faith, there can actually be real communion, real channels of grace to experience healing. Today, it's nothing more than public validation on social media. And there's something really deeply revealing about this public display of grief on social media. It begins with genuine love. There are a lot of people here who are going through sincere anguish, but quickly it's the same architecture all over again. The mourner creates content and finds themselves trapped in that strange ongoing theater that now their grief is their brand. It's a role that they must keep tapping on again and again so that it's legible to a particular audience that they've developed. Irving Goffman, a sociologist, has a classic account of some of this in his book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. He talks about human interaction through what he calls a dramaturgical lens. People manage their impressions before others. They try to control how others perceive themselves. We all know this to a certain level. The problem is social media now has supplied us with these limited windows that we can curate a self that is sometimes completely untrue from the real self. But it's a stage. And for this grief talk reality, it's a stage where sorrow is the new self that an individual must keep serving up again and again. I want to be honest here. Some online memorial expressions are true. Many people share grieving posts and they just want people to know. I can acknowledge that, and I don't want to knock that, honestly. Some people really do put out deep affection or honest shock, a sincere need for others to remember their beloved who has died. I understand the impetus. The problem is the platform and the grammar shaped by the platform. Because a one-off post or a few posts about a beloved who's passed is something else entirely from an online persona that's been curated around the grief and of the loss of the loved one, and that constant pursuit of visible affirmation. The older language of mourning used to teach us that when we experienced the wound of loss, of death, we would take it to the presence of God and the communion of the covenant family in the church. And so we would have these avenues where real fruit could come from it, even if we didn't immediately see it. Grace is a real thing that is poured out from the heart of God into us. The problem with the newer language of this social media networked grief is that it forces a person to keep asking not whether my grief was genuine in that post, but whether the post gained enough traction. Should I have phrased this a different way? Should I have posted at a certain time in this certain way, edited in a certain way? So now the tribute is not about sincerity. It's about whether the photograph was attractive, whether enough people responded, shared, liked, and commented, and if I'm silent, will people care enough? Do I have to keep putting out content on this grief to stay relevant? And that's why the thing can easily become spiritually grotesque. I've looked at some of the statements of some of the individuals involved in grief talk, and it's ridiculous is an understatement. Modern technology has unfortunately curated an entire avenue where individuals are forced to keep tapping on hurt that they sometimes don't have, because the algorithm that they have curated has trained the content to only respond in that particular way. And so they have to keep asking, does my grief have sufficient social media reach? The psychological consequences of this are rather obvious. A person that's already overwhelmed by death can be burdened now because of the social media element by performative pressure, and also a thing called comparative sorrow. Does what I'm going through right now compare with the grief that someone else is going through? Can I ham this up in some way to at least be on par or more so that I can get more views, likes, shares, and comments? And it drives into emotional exhaustion, psychological exhaustion, because that same platform is utilizing this content to advertise, to monetize. Psychologist Klaas Silverman Nickman, they, in their work, Continuing Bonds, New Understandings of Grief, they came up with the phrase continuing bonds. What they argued for is that many people who are grieving, bereaved persons, they maintain enduring relationships with the dead. They don't just sever the attachment. And what's funny about it is, if you read their research, all they are talking about is not alien to the Christian, the Catholic especially. We believe with all our hearts that there is no real separation between the church on earth, the church suffering in purgatory, and the church triumphant in heaven. That is the reality of Christian memory, of biblical memory. And therefore, psychology is only recently discovering what the church has said stalwartly for 2,000 years. Our love for our loved ones doesn't end at the grave. Only a materialistic perspective does that. And unfortunately, if I'm going to be very honest, as a former Protestant, Protestant theology does that too. That there is a complete cutting off because you're not connected to souls on the other side of the veil. Social media then takes this narrative of continuing bonds into something public and constantly persistent. My ongoing relationship with my dead loved one now has to be put forth for the public to view. Posting rhythms, digital memorial pages, annual notifications. I'm seeking more comment threads. The social media platforms have become strange little shrines to these individuals who have passed on. I want to be sensitive here. This is coming from a place of tremendous hurt. Those who have passed on are deeply loved, but there's a real danger if we're using social media and a curated social media identity to substitute prayer and the sacraments, the embodied presence of Christ and others in the body of Christ, and the hard interior work that we have to go through in grief so that we can slowly learn what life means after being wounded by death. If we don't do that work, if we don't engage in that reality, we will run the risk of disconnecting from what is actually human and flourishing. C.S. Lewis understood grief with far greater clarity than most people. In his work, A Grief Observed, he wrote, "God has not been trying an experiment on my faith or love in order to find out their quality. He knew it already. It was I who didn't." But then he goes on to say, the danger is not my admitting there's no God at all. It's that if I start thinking, so this is what God's really like, deceive yourself no longer. Now, what he's effectively saying is this. God whispers to us in our pleasure. I'm quoting him from The Problem of Pain. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. In other words, in the worst grief we can encounter, the Catholic answer is to look upon the face of God, who alone gives tremendous meaning to our grief. Because when we look at the face of God in the Catholic doctrine, we know that he alone can tell us even the death you're experiencing right now will have meaning in the afterlife. There will be a light, there will be a resurrection, and that's the everlasting gladness. Stay tuned, I'm Marcus Peter.